This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit www.librivox.org. Washington Square by Henry James, read for Librivox by Dawn Murphy in El Segundo, California. Chapter 32. Our story has hitherto moved with very short steps, but as it approaches its termination it must take a long stride. As time went on, it might have appeared to the doctor that his daughter's account of her rupture with Morris Townsend, mere bravado as he had deemed it, was in some degree justified by the sequel. Morris remained as rigidly and unremittingly absent as if he had died of a broken heart, and Catherine had apparently buried the memory of this fruitless episode as deep as if it had terminated by her own choice. We know that she had been deeply and incurably wounded, but the doctor had no means of knowing it. He was certainly curious about it, and would have given a good deal to discover the exact truth. But it was his punishment that he never knew. His punishment, I mean, for the abuse of sarcasm in his relations with his daughter. There was a good deal of effective sarcasm in her keeping him in the dark, and the rest of the world conspired with her, in this sense, to be sarcastic. Mrs. Penniman told him nothing, partly because he never questioned her. He made too light of Mrs. Penniman for that, and partly because she flattered herself that a tormenting reserve and a serene profession of ignorance would avenge her for his theory that she had meddled in the matter. He went 2 or 3 times to see Mrs. Montgomery, but Mrs. Montgomery had nothing to impart. She simply knew that her brother's engagement was broken off, and now that Miss Sloper was out of danger she preferred not to bear witness in any way against Morris. She had done so before, however unwillingly, because she was sorry for Miss Sloper. But she was not sorry for Miss Sloper now, not at all sorry. Morris had told her nothing about his relations with Miss Sloper at the time, and he had told her nothing since. He was always away, and he very seldom wrote to her. She believed he had gone to California. Mrs. Almond had, in her sister's phrase, taken up Catherine violently since the recent catastrophe. But though the girl was very grateful to her for her kindness, she revealed no secrets, and the good lady could give the doctor no satisfaction. Even, however, had she been able to narrate to him the private history of his daughter's unhappy love affair, it would have given her a certain comfort to leave him in ignorance. For Mrs. Almond was at this time not altogether in sympathy with her brother. She had guessed for herself that Catherine had been cruelly jilted. She knew nothing from Mrs. Penniman, for Mrs. Penniman had not ventured to lay the famous explanation of Morris's motives before Mrs. Almond, though she had thought it good enough for Catherine, and she pronounced her brother too consistently indifferent to what the poor creature must have suffered and must still be suffering. Dr. Sloper had his theory, and he rarely altered his theories. The marriage would have been an abominable one, and the girl had had a blessed escape. She was not to be pitied for that, and to pretend to condole with her would have been to make concessions to the idea that she had ever had a right to think of Morris. "I put my foot on this idea from the first, and I keep it there now," said the doctor. "I don't see anything cruel in that. One can't keep it there too long." To this Mrs. Almond more than once replied that, if Catherine had not rid of her congruous lover, she deserved the credit of it, and that to bring herself to her father's enlightened view of the matter must have cost her an effort that he was bound to appreciate. "I am by no means sure she has got rid of him," said the doctor. "There is not the smallest probability that, after having been as obstinate as a mule for 2 years, she suddenly became amenable to reason. It is infinitely more probable that he got rid of her. All the more reason you should be gentle with her. I am gentle with her, but I can't do the pathetic. I can't pump up tears to look graceful over the most fortunate thing that ever happened to her." "You have no sympathy," said Mrs. Almond. "That was never your strong point. You have only to look at her to see that, right or wrong, and whether the rupture came from herself or from him, her poor little heart is grievously bruised. Handling bruises, and even dropping tears on them, doesn't make them any better. My business is to see she gets no more knocks, and that I shall carefully attend to. But I don't at all recognize your description of Catherine. She doesn't strike me in the least as a young woman going about in search of a moral poultice. In fact, she seems to me much better than while the fellow was hanging about. She is perfectly comfortable and blooming. She eats and sleeps, takes her usual exercise, and overloads herself as usual with finery. She is always knitting some purse or embroidering some handkerchief, and it seems to me she turns these articles out about as fast as ever. She hasn't much to say, but when had she anything to say? She had her little dance, and now she is sitting down to rest. I suspect that, on the whole, she enjoys it. She enjoys it as people enjoy getting rid of a leg that has been crushed. The state of mind after amputation is doubtless one of comparative repose." "If your leg is a metaphor for young Townsend, I can assure you he has never been crushed. Crushed? Not he. He is alive and perfectly intact, and that's why I am not satisfied." "Should you have liked to kill him?" asked Mrs. Almond. "Yes, very much. I think it is quite possible that it is all a blind." "A blind?" "An arrangement between them. Il fait la mort, as they say in France. But he is looking out of the corner of his eye. You can depend upon it, he has not burnt his ships. He has kept one to come back in. When I am dead, he will set sail again, and then she will marry him." "It is interesting to know that you accuse your only daughter of being the vilest of hypocrites," said Mrs. Almond. "I don't see what difference her being my only daughter makes. It is better to accuse one than a dozen. But I don't accuse any one. There is not the smallest hypocrisy about Catherine, and I deny that she even pretends to be miserable." The doctor's idea that the thing was a blind had its intermissions and revivals, but it may be said, on the whole, to have increased as he grew older, together with his impressions of Catherine's blooming and comfortable condition. Naturally, if he had not found grounds for viewing her as a love-lorn maiden during the year or two that followed her great trouble, he found none at a time when she had completely recovered her self-possession. He was obliged to recognize the fact that, if the two young people were waiting for him to get out of the way, they were at least waiting very patiently. He had heard from time to time that Morris was in New York, but he never remained there long, and to the best of the doctor's belief had no communication with Catherine. He was sure they never met, and he had reason to suspect that Morris never wrote to her. After the letter that had been mentioned, she heard from him twice again, at considerable intervals, but on none of these occasions did she write herself. On the other hand, as the doctor observed, she averted herself rigidly from the idea of marrying other people. Her opportunities for doing so were not numerous, but they occurred often enough to test her disposition. She refused a widower, a man with a genial temperament, a handsome fortune, and 3 little girls. He had heard that she was very fond of children, and he pointed to his own with some confidence, and she turned a deaf ear to the solicitations of a clever young lawyer, who, with the prospect of a great practice and the reputation of a most agreeable man, had had the shrewdness, when he came to look about him for a wife, to believe that she would suit him better than several younger and prettier girls. Mr. McAllister, the widower, had desired to make a marriage of reason, and had chosen Catherine for what he supposed to be her latent matronly qualities. But John Ludlow, who was a year the girl's junior, and spoken of always as a young man who might have had his pick, was seriously in love with her. Catherine, however, would never look at him. She made it plain to him that she thought he came to see her too often. He afterward consoled himself and married a very different person, little Miss Sturtevant, whose attractions were obvious to the dullest comprehension. Catherine, at the time of these events, had left her 30th year well behind her, and had quite taken her place as an old maid. Her father would have preferred she should marry, and he once told her that he hoped she would not be too fastidious. "I should like to see you an honest man's wife before I die," he said. This was after John Ludlow had been compelled to give it up, though the doctor had advised him to persevere. The doctor exercised no further pressure, and had the credit of not worrying at all over his daughter's singleness. In fact, he worried rather more than appeared, and there were considerable periods during which he felt sure that Morris Townsend was hidden behind some door. "If he is not, why doesn't she marry?" he asked himself. "Limited as her intelligence may be, she must understand perfectly well that she is made to do the usual thing." Catherine, however, became an admirable old maid. She formed habits, regulated her days upon a system of her own, interested herself in charitable institutions, asylums, hospitals, and aid societies, and went generally with an even and noiseless step about the rigid business of her life. This life had, however, a secret history as well as a public one. If I may talk of the public history of a mature and diffident spinster for whom publicity had always a combination of terrors. From her own point of view, the great facts of her career were that Morris Townsend had trifled with her affection, and that her father had broken its spring. Nothing could ever alter these facts. They were always there, like her name, her age, her plain face. Nothing could ever undo the wrong or cure the pain that Morris had inflicted on her, and nothing could ever make her feel toward her father as she felt in her younger years. There was something dead in her life, and her duty was to try and fill the void. Catherine recognized this duty to the utmost. She had a great disapproval of brooding and moping. She had, of course, no faculty for quenching memory in dissipation, but she mingled freely in the usual gaieties of the town, and she became at last an inevitable figure at all respectable entertainments. She was greatly liked, and as time went on she grew to be a sort of kindly maiden aunt to the younger portion of society. Young girls were apt to confide to her their love affairs, which they never did to Mrs. Penniman, and young men to be fond of her without knowing why. She developed a few harmless eccentricities. Her habits, once formed, were rather stiffly maintained. Her opinions on all moral and social matters were extremely conservative, and before she was 40 she was regarded as an old-fashioned person, and an authority on customs that had passed away. Mrs. Penniman, in comparison, was quite a girlish figure. She grew younger as she advanced in life. She lost none of her relish for beauty and mystery, but she had little opportunity to exercise it. With Catherine's later wooers she failed to establish relations as intimate as those which had given her so many interesting hours in the society of Morris Townsend. These gentlemen had an indefinable mistrust of her good offices, and they never talked to her about Catherine's charms. Her ringlets, her buckles and bangles glistened more brightly with each succeeding year, and she remained quite the same officious and imaginative Mrs. Penniman, and the odd mixture of impetuosity and circumspection that we have hitherto known. As regards one point, however, her circumspection prevailed, and she must be given due credit for it. For upward of 17 years she never mentioned Morris Townsend's name to her niece. Catherine was grateful to her, but this consistent silence, so little in accord with her aunt's character, gave her a certain alarm, and she could never wholly rid herself of a suspicion that Mrs. Penniman sometimes had news of him. End of Chapter 32. This has been a Librivox recording of Washington Square, a novel by Henry James, read for Librivox by Dawn Murphy, in El Segundo, California,